Hey everyone, tonight we're heading somewhere you've probably never imagined. A small convent tucked into the hills of Tuscany, where the air smells like incense and secrets, and where one woman is about to turn the entire religious establishment upside down using nothing but visions, charisma, and some very creative theology. Honestly, you wouldn't make it an hour out here. Most people today would tap out before sunrise. The food is terrible, the schedule is punishing, and your entire existence revolves around prayer, obedience, and trying not to freeze to death in winter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is there. Lower the lights, let the quiet hum of the room fill the air, and let's drift into tonight's story. It's 1619, and you're standing in the small Tuscan town of Pescia, watching a young woman named Benedetta Carlini take her final vows. She's 23 years old, and if you could see into the future, you'd know that within a few years, she'll be running this place. You'd also know that in about a decade, she'll be on trial for heresy, sexual misconduct, and claiming that Jesus Christ himself commanded her to seduce her fellow nun. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The convent is called the Theatines, though technically it's the Congregation of the Mother of God. It's small, maybe 30 nuns at most, and it sits on the edge of town like a grey stone bookmark pressed between earth and sky. The walls are thick enough to keep out the noise of the market, the gossip of neighbors, and presumably, the more complicated truths about what happens inside. The chapel is modest, the cells are smaller, and the whole place smells like candle wax, old wood, and the particular mustiness of religious devotion that hasn't seen fresh air in a while. Benedetta isn't nobility, but she's not peasant stock either. Her family is middling, respectable enough to have a little money, desperate enough to need the social credit that comes with having a visionary daughter. And Benedetta has been having visions since childhood. Angels, mostly. Sometimes the Virgin Mary. Occasionally Jesus himself, though those encounters will become much more frequent and significantly more physical as our story unfolds. You watch as she kneels before the abbess, her head bowed, her voice steady as she promises obedience, chastity, and poverty. The other nuns are watching too, some with genuine piety, others with the tired resignation of women who have been trapped in this routine for decades. One or two are watching Benedetta with something that might be suspicion, or might be fascination. It's hard to tell in candlelight. Here's what you need to understand about convents in 17th century Italy. They weren't just houses of prayer. They were also dumping grounds for inconvenient daughters, refuges for women fleeing bad marriages, and occasionally the only place a woman could exercise any real authority. Some nuns had genuine vocations. Others were there because their families couldn't afford dowries, or because they'd been compromised in some way, or simply because there was nowhere else for them to go. The convent was a world within a world, governed by its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own peculiar economies of power. Benedetta, you'll soon learn, understands power better than most. She spent her whole life watching how authority works, how men wield it through force and title, how women have to be more creative. Visions, for instance, are an excellent currency. If God speaks through you, who can argue? If angels give you instructions, who can refuse? It's the perfect religious loophole, and Benedetta is about to exploit it with the skill of a Renaissance lawyer. The ceremony ends. The other nuns file out, heading toward the refectory for a meal that will be, let's be honest, deeply disappointing. Bread, thin soup, maybe some vegetables if the season is right. You'd kill for a decent coffee, but coffee won't become popular in Italy for another few decades. And even then, it won't make it past these walls for a long time. Instead, you get weak wine and the knowledge that this exact meal will be repeated with minor variations for the rest of your natural life. Benedetta rises from her knees. She's not beautiful in any conventional sense. The records don't describe her appearance much, which usually means she was ordinary looking. But there's something in the way she moves. A certainty. A sense that she's operating on information the rest of you don't have access to. And maybe she is. Maybe the visions are real. Maybe God really does whisper in her ear while she prays. Or maybe she's just brilliant at reading people, at understanding what they want to believe, and at giving it to them in ways they can't resist. You'll spend the next few years trying to figure out which one it is. Spoiler, you probably never will. You need to understand where Benedetta came from, because nothing about her story makes sense without it. So let's rewind a bit, back to when she was just a child in a modest household, already seeing things that other people couldn't see, already learning that the invisible world could be more useful than the visible one. Benedetta was born in 1590 in Villano, a tiny hamlet so small it barely qualifies as a dot on a map. Her father, Giuliano Carlini, was a notary, respectable work, the kind that keeps you fed but doesn't make you rich. Her mother's name doesn't appear much in the records, which tells you everything about whose stories got preserved and whose didn't. They had enough money to live decently, but not enough to be comfortable, and like most families in that position, they were always one bad harvest or one expensive illness away from disaster. When Benedetta was around 9 years old, she started having visions. Not subtle ones either. Full theatrical productions featuring the Virgin Mary, various saints, and a supporting cast of angels who apparently had very specific opinions about Benedetta's spiritual future. According to the accounts, Mary herself appeared and told Benedetta she was destined for great things. An angel showed up to protect her from a demon who tried to push her off a balcony. Another time, the devil appeared as a handsome young man, because of course he did, and tried to seduce her, only to be driven off by divine intervention. Now, you might be thinking, was this child actually having mystical experiences, or was she just very good at getting attention? And the answer is, well, that's the question that will follow her for her entire life. What matters is that people believed her, or at least, they believed her enough. Her parents certainly saw an opportunity. Having a visionary daughter was like winning a small religious lottery. It brought prestige, respect, and most importantly, it opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. Convents often waived dowry requirements for girls who showed signs of genuine sanctity. If Benedetta could convince the right people that God had plans for her, the Carlini family wouldn't have to pay a cent to get her settled into respectable religious life. So when Benedetta was 9, her parents brought her to the Theatine Convent in Pescia. They met with the abbess, told stories about the visions, maybe exaggerated a little, or maybe not. Maybe everything they said was true, who knows? And the abbess agreed to take Benedetta as a student. Not a full nun yet, but a girl who would be raised in the convent, educated in prayer and devotion, and eventually, if she proved worthy, allowed to take vows. You watch young Benedetta settle into convent life. She's smaller than the other girls, darker-haired, intense in a way that makes some of the nuns uncomfortable. She prays with a focus that borders on aggressive. When she's supposed to be doing needlework, you catch her staring at the crucifix like she's trying to decode a secret message written in blood and wood. The visions continue. Sometimes she reports them dutifully to the abbess. Other times she keeps them private, understanding even at 9 years old that mystery is more powerful than explanation. She learns quickly which visions impress people and which ones make them nervous. Angels are good. The Virgin Mary is excellent. Jesus is acceptable, as long as the encounters remain appropriately chaste and devotional. Here's something interesting that historians have noted: child visionaries were surprisingly common in this period. Religious ecstasy was one of the few forms of power available to women, and convents were full of girls who'd learned that performing sanctity could earn them respect, autonomy, or at least better treatment than they'd get as ordinary nuns. Some were probably genuine mystics, having real spiritual experiences. Others were skilled performers. Most were probably somewhere in between. People who genuinely believed their own visions, but also understood how to shape those visions into narratives that served their interests. Benedetta grows up in the convent, and you watch her learn its rhythms. The bells that mark the hours for prayer matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. The endless repetition of psalms until the words lose meaning and become pure sound. The cold stone floors that hurt your knees during prayer. The thin mattresses stuffed with straw that somehow manage to be both lumpy and flat. The food that tastes like punishment. The silence that's supposed to bring you closer to God, but mostly just amplifies every bodily function until you're hyper-aware of your own breathing, swallowing, digesting. She also learns the social architecture of the place, which nuns have power and which ones are invisible. Who makes decisions and who just follows orders. She watches the abbess, a woman who rules this tiny kingdom with the authority of someone who knows that within these walls, she outranks almost everyone. The local priests might have theological authority, but day-to-day operations belong to the abbess. She decides who eats what, who sleeps where, who gets punished, and who gets praised. Benedetta wants that position. You can see it in how she watches, how she calculates, how she positions herself always just slightly ahead of where she's supposed to be. She's ambitious, which is dangerous for a woman in this time, but she's also smart enough to disguise her ambition as divine calling. It's not that she wants power. Oh no, of course not. It's that God wants her to have power. Big difference. By the time she's 23 and taking her final vows, she's been in the convent for 14 years. It's the only adult life she knows. And she's ready to make it hers. Now that you've officially joined the ranks of the professed nuns, let's talk about what your daily life actually looks like in this place. Because if you're going to understand how Benedetta manages to build her own little empire of ecstasy and authority, you need to know the world she's working within, every boring, repetitive, soul-grinding detail of it. First, the schedule. Your day begins around 2 in the morning. Yes, 2, when the bell rings for matins. You drag yourself from your narrow bed in your tiny cell, wrap yourself in your habit because it's absolutely freezing, and stumble through the dark corridors to the chapel. Your breath makes clouds in the cold air. Your fingers are numb. You're so tired you could cry, except crying would require energy you don't have. You file into the chapel with the other nuns, all of you moving like sleepwalkers, and you begin the first round of prayers. Psalms, mostly. The same ones you sang yesterday and the day before and the day before that. The Latin becomes a kind of music after a while, meaningless but comforting in its familiarity. You're not really thinking about God at 2 in the morning. You're thinking about going back to bed. Everyone is. That's the secret no one admits. Most religious devotion is just endurance with better marketing. After matins, you're technically supposed to stay awake for lauds at dawn, but some nuns sneak back to their cells for another hour of sleep. The abbess pretends not to notice as long as everyone shows up for prime, the first daytime prayer, around 6 in the morning. By then, the sun is rising, if it's summer. If it's winter, you're still in the dark, and you'll stay in the dark for most of your waking hours because candles are expensive and the convent budget is tight. Breakfast is bread. Sometimes there's cheese. On special occasions, saints' feast days, major holidays, you might get an egg. You eat in silence, while one of the nuns reads aloud from the lives of the saints, which is supposed to be spiritually edifying, but is mostly just a reminder that if you were really holy, you'd be happy to suffer more than you already are. After breakfast, it's time for work. Convents are supposed to be self-sufficient, which means everyone has jobs. Some nuns work in the garden, growing vegetables and herbs. Others do laundry, which is exactly as backbreaking as it sounds when you're hauling water from the well and scrubbing everything by hand. Some handle the kitchen, transforming meager ingredients into meals that won't technically kill you, but won't make you glad to be alive either. Then there's the needlework. Oh, the needlework. Hours and hours of embroidery, sewing, mending. The convent makes altar cloths, vestments for priests, decorative linens for wealthy families, anything that can be sold to bring in money. Your fingers cramp. Your eyes strain in the dim light. You stab yourself with the needle so often that your fingertips are decorated with little dots of dried blood. Some nuns are good at this work and find it meditative. Others, probably you, let's be honest, are terrible at it and spend every moment resenting the fact that your entire existence has been reduced to making decorative flowers on cloth that someone else will use. Between work sessions, there are more prayers. Terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3. You stop what you're doing, file back to the chapel, sing more psalms, and return to work. It's like having a job where your boss interrupts you every 3 hours to remind you that you're doing everything for God's glory, not your own satisfaction. Which, now that you think about it, is exactly what this is. The main meal comes after none, around mid-afternoon. It's usually soup, vegetable bean, occasionally with a bit of fish if it's Friday or a feast day. Meat is rare. Flavor is rarer. You eat what you're given and you're grateful, or at least you pretend to be grateful because complaining about food is considered evidence of spiritual weakness. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The convent isn't actually as isolated as it's supposed to be. There's a visiting room where families can come talk to their daughters through a grated window. There are servants who come and go, bringing supplies and gossip from town. There are priests who hear confessions and say Mass. There are visiting church officials, local nobles who donate money, tradespeople delivering goods. All of these people bring news, rumors, and most importantly, awareness of the outside world. Benedetta pays attention to all of it. You watch her position herself near the visiting room when important families come by. You notice how she volunteers to speak with the priests, how she manages to be present whenever church officials visit. She's building a network, cultivating relationships, making sure that her name and her visions are known beyond these walls. Because here's the thing about convents, they're supposed to be separate from the world, but they're not. They exist in constant tension with the society around them. They need money from wealthy donors. They need approval from church authorities. They need their reputation to stay intact so that families keep sending daughters and dowries. The nuns might be cloistered, but the convent itself is embedded in a web of social, economic, and political relationships. And Benedetta understands this better than anyone. She's not just a mystic, she's a strategist. Every vision she reports, every ecstatic episode she performs, every moment of apparent divine favor is also a move in a larger game. She's making herself indispensable, irreplaceable, the one person in this convent whom God apparently can't shut up about. The other nuns notice, of course. Some admire her, some are jealous. A few are suspicious. But mostly, they're just tired. Tired from the schedule, tired from the work, tired from the endless repetition of days that all look exactly the same. When someone like Benedetta shows up claiming that angels are visiting her with special messages, it's at least interesting. It breaks the monotony. It gives everyone something to talk about besides the quality of the soup. So they watch her. They whisper about her, and they wait to see what she'll do next. You're watching too. And you're starting to realize that in this small, enclosed world where nothing ever happens, Benedetta is about to make absolutely everything happen. It's 1619, just a few months after Benedetta has taken her final vows, and something is shifting. You can feel it in the air, the way you can feel a thunderstorm building before the first drops fall. The other nuns sense it too. Conversations drop to whispers when Benedetta enters a room, and there's a new quality to the silence during prayer, like everyone's waiting for something to break. The visions have always been part of Benedetta's story, but now they're escalating. They're becoming more frequent, more dramatic, more impossible to ignore. And conveniently, or suspiciously, depending on your perspective, they're happening in front of witnesses. The first major episode occurs during evening prayers. You're in the chapel, going through Vespers with the kind of autopilot devotion that comes from saying the same prayers every single day for years. The light is fading outside, the candles are lit, and everything is proceeding exactly as it always does. Then Benedetta gasps. It's not a quiet gasp. It's the kind of sharp intake of breath that makes everyone's head turn. She's gone rigid in her seat, her eyes wide and fixed on something the rest of you can't see. Her hands are gripping the edge of the pew so hard her knuckles have gone white. One of the nuns nearest to her reaches out, concerned, but Benedetta doesn't seem to notice. She's somewhere else entirely. Then she speaks. But it's not her voice, or at least, she claims it's not her voice. It's deeper, more resonant, with an odd quality that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. She's speaking in Latin, which wouldn't be remarkable except that Benedetta's Latin has always been mediocre at best, and now she's rattling off complex theological phrases like she's been studying at a university. The words are about purification, about the convent needing to be cleansed of sin, about how God is watching and finding the community wanting. It's the kind of message that's both vague enough to be unfalsifiable and specific enough to make everyone feel personally guilty. Brilliant strategy, really. After a few minutes, Benedetta collapses, just drops like someone cut her strings. The nuns rush to her, lifting her up, carrying her back to her cell. She's limp, barely conscious, murmuring things nobody can quite make out. The abbess is summoned. A physician is sent for. Not that physicians in 1619 have any idea what to do with religious ecstasy, but appearances must be maintained. When Benedetta comes around, she claims she doesn't remember anything. She says she was visited by an angel who wanted to deliver a message to the convent, and that the angel used her body as a vessel. She's appropriately humble about it, appropriately distressed. She didn't ask for this, she insists. She wishes it would stop. She's just a simple nun trying to serve God, and she has no idea why heaven keeps interrupting her quiet devotions with these dramatic interventions. Right, sure, a simple nun, who just happens to deliver prophetic messages that position her as God's special messenger, who just happens to collapse in ways that require multiple people to attend to her, who just happens to become the center of attention in a community where attention is the scarcest resource available. You're not sure whether you believe her, but you have to admit, it's compelling theater. The episodes continue. Sometimes they happen during prayer. Sometimes during meals, which has the added drama of Benedetta dropping her spoon and startling everyone out of their enforced silence. Sometimes they happen in her cell, and other nuns hear her crying out or speaking in that strange voice, and they gather outside her door, both frightened and fascinated. Here's what historians know: religious ecstasy was a recognized phenomenon in this period, but it was also deeply problematic. The Catholic Church accepted that genuine mystical experiences could happen. There were plenty of recognized saints who'd had visions and performed miracles. But the Church was also paranoid about false mystics, about women claiming divine authority to mask heresy or worse, demonic possession. The trick was figuring out which was which, and the guidelines were maddeningly vague. Real visions should lead to humility and obedience, but they should also demonstrate genuine supernatural knowledge. The visionary should be reluctant and distressed by their experiences, but they should also be able to articulate clear divine messages. The visions should reinforce church authority, but they should also reveal new truths that even church authorities don't know yet. Basically, you had to thread a needle while blindfolded, and everyone watching was hoping you'd stab yourself. Benedetta, to her credit, navigates this beautifully. Her visions are dramatic enough to be convincing, but orthodox enough to avoid immediate heresy charges. She predicts things that are vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways later. She delivers messages that flatter the existing power structure while also suggesting that she deserves a more prominent role within it. When church officials come to examine her, she's appropriately deferential while also making it clear that she's just the messenger. If they have a problem with the content, they'll need to take it up with God. The abbess doesn't know what to do with her. On one hand, having a genuine mystic in the convent would be incredible for the community's reputation. Donations would increase. Noble families would be clamoring to send their daughters here. The convent's spiritual prestige would rise dramatically. On the other hand, mystics are unstable. They are unpredictable. They have a tendency to criticize authority, to claim that God told them to do things that contradict what their superiors want, to generally cause chaos in communities that depend on order and routine. So the abbess watches. She documents. She reports to the local bishop, who reports to his superiors, and everyone agrees to observe Benedetta carefully while also not shutting her down entirely. Because what if she's the real thing? What if God really is speaking through this intense young nun with the theatrical collapses and the convenient prophecies? What if they are witnessing the birth of a saint? You watch all of this unfold, and you realize something. It doesn't actually matter whether the visions are real. What matters is that people believe they might be real. And belief, as Benedetta is proving, is the most powerful force in this building. More powerful than the abbess, more powerful than the rules, more powerful even than the thick stone walls that are supposed to keep the world out and keep all of you in. It's 1620, and someone new is about to enter the story. Her name is Bartolomea Crivelli, and if you could warn her about what's coming, you probably would. But history doesn't work that way. So instead you just watch as this young woman walks through the convent gates, carrying whatever small possessions she's been allowed to keep, completely unaware that she's about to become the most controversial figure in Benedetta's increasingly complicated narrative. Bartolomea is younger than most of the other novices, maybe 18 or 19, though the records aren't entirely clear. She comes from a family that's respectable enough to have a surname, but not wealthy enough to have options. The usual story: not enough money for a proper dowry, too many daughters, and a convent seems like the best solution for everyone involved. Whether Bartolomea actually wants to be here is a question nobody bothers to ask. Women's preferences weren't really part of the equation. You watch her arrive during the midday meal. The abbess introduces her to the community. A brief, formal announcement that there's a new sister joining them. Please make her feel welcome. God bless us all. Bartolomea stands there looking simultaneously terrified and determined, the way people look when they're trying very hard not to cry in public. Her habit is new and doesn't quite fit right. She'll grow into it, the abbess says, which is both literally true and a metaphor for everything that's about to happen. The other nuns eye her with mild interest. New arrivals are always a brief source of entertainment in a place where entertainment is scarce. They bring news from outside, different perspectives, fresh energy. But mostly, everyone's just calculating how this newcomer will affect the existing social dynamics. Will she align herself with the older, more conservative nuns? Will she be pious and boring? Will she cause trouble? Benedetta is watching too, and unlike the others who lose interest after a few minutes and go back to their soup, Benedetta keeps watching. There's something in her gaze that you can't quite read. Calculation, maybe, or recognition. Like she's seeing not who Bartolomea is now, but who she could become with the right guidance. After the meal, Benedetta approaches the abbess. She volunteers, very humbly, very charitably, to take Bartolomea under her wing, to help her adjust to convent life, to guide her spiritual development, to make sure she understands the rules and rhythms of the community. It's a perfectly reasonable offer. Senior nuns often mentor newcomers. It's how the system works. The abbess agrees. Of course she does. Benedetta is by now recognized as one of the most spiritually advanced nuns in the community. Her visions have continued, her reputation has grown, and she's seen as someone who has a special connection to the divine. Who better to educate a young, impressionable novice? So Bartolomea is assigned to Benedetta's care. And you watch as Benedetta begins what she'll later describe as spiritual mentorship, and what Bartolomea will eventually describe as something else entirely. At first, it looks innocent enough. Benedetta helps Bartolomea learn the schedule, shows her where things are kept, explains the unwritten rules that govern convent life. She's patient and kind, more approachable than many of the older nuns who treat novices like irritating interruptions to their routine. Bartolomea is grateful. She's alone in a strange place, and here's someone offering friendship, guidance, attention. You notice how Benedetta positions herself as Bartolomea's primary source of information and support. When Bartolomea has questions, she asks Benedetta. When she's confused or upset, she goes to Benedetta. When she needs to confess her sins, Benedetta suggests that she can help prepare her for confession with the priest, that they can pray together first, work through any spiritual struggles in private. It's grooming, though nobody has that word yet. It's the careful construction of dependency, the slow isolation of one person from other sources of support, the gradual establishment of a relationship where one person holds all the power, and the other person learns that their safety and comfort depend on maintaining that imbalance. But it doesn't feel like that, not at first. It feels like friendship. It feels like maybe Bartolomea has found someone who actually cares about her in this cold, institutional place, where most of the nuns are too absorbed in their own struggles to pay much attention to a frightened teenager. Benedetta tells Bartolomea about her visions. Not all of them, not right away, but gradually. She describes the angels who visit her, the messages she receives, the special relationship she has with heaven. She makes it sound wondrous and terrifying in equal measure, a burden she carries, a gift she didn't ask for, a responsibility that sets her apart from ordinary nuns. Bartolomea is awed. Of course she is. She's young, she's been raised to believe in miracles and saints, and here's someone claiming direct contact with the divine. Someone who's chosen to share these secrets with her, to make her part of something extraordinary. Here's what makes this complicated. In 17th century convents, intense friendships between nuns were normal, even expected. These women lived together in close quarters, saw each other every day, had limited contact with the outside world. They formed deep emotional bonds, wrote passionate letters to each other, used language that to modern ears sounds unmistakably romantic. Historians call these relationships romantic friendships and debate endlessly about whether they were sexual or just emotionally intense in ways that our culture doesn't quite have a framework for. The Church was theoretically opposed to particular friendships, relationships between two nuns that excluded others or became too emotionally consuming. But in practice, these friendships were everywhere, and authorities mostly looked the other way as long as things didn't get too obvious or too disruptive. So when Benedetta and Bartolomea start spending more time together, praying together, sitting next to each other during meals, nobody thinks much of it. It looks like mentorship. It looks like friendship. It looks like the kind of bond that develops naturally when you put people in close quarters and give them limited other options for human connection. It will be 2 years before anyone understands what's actually happening behind Benedetta's closed door. 2 years before Bartolomea finds the words and the courage to explain that what Benedetta calls spiritual instruction has very little to do with prayer and everything to do with coercion disguised as divine command. But right now, in 1620, all of that is still ahead. Right now, Bartolomea is just a lonely young woman who thinks she's found a friend. And Benedetta is watching her with the patience of someone who knows exactly what she wants and exactly how long she's willing to wait to get it. It's around 1621, and Benedetta's spiritual entourage is expanding. She's no longer just receiving visits from generic angels and the occasional appearance by the Virgin Mary. Now she has a personal guardian angel with a name, a personality, and some very specific opinions about how the convent should be run. His name is Splenditalo, which translates roughly to little splendor, and he's about to become the most convenient theological device Benedetta has ever invented. You first hear about Splenditalo during a community meeting. Benedetta stands before the assembled nuns, her expression appropriately humble, and explains that she's been assigned a special angelic protector. This isn't unusual. Catholic theology has always maintained that everyone has a guardian angel. What's unusual is that Benedetta's angel apparently can't stop talking. He has messages. He has instructions. He has a whole agenda, really, and Benedetta is just the messenger, the humble vessel through which Splenditalo communicates his divine will. Splenditalo, according to Benedetta, is beautiful beyond description. He has wings that shimmer like sunlight on water. His voice is like music. When he appears, the room fills with a scent like roses and honey. He's powerful, wise, and completely devoted to Benedetta's spiritual welfare, which, conveniently, seems to align perfectly with Benedetta's earthly ambitions. The angel's first major message is about the convent's spiritual laxity. He's disappointed, Benedetta reports. The nuns aren't praying enough. They're not taking their vows seriously enough. There's gossip, petty jealousies, insufficient devotion. Splenditalo wants everyone to do better. He wants longer prayer sessions, stricter fasting, more rigorous self-examination. It's the kind of message that's impossible to argue with. Who's going to stand up and say, "Actually, I think the angel is wrong, we're doing fine"? Nobody, that's who. So the nuns nod and murmur their agreement and privately wonder if this means even less food and even more time on their knees in the cold chapel. But Splendidolo isn't just about criticism. He also has praise, specifically for Benedetta. He tells her constantly, she reports, how special she is, how chosen, how rare her spiritual gifts are. He says that God has great plans for her. He says she's destined to lead, to transform this community, to become a beacon of holiness that will shine far beyond these walls. Again, convenient. Very convenient. Almost suspiciously convenient. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Splendidolo doesn't just appear to Benedetta privately. Sometimes, she claims, he takes over her body and speaks directly through her. When this happens, Benedetta's voice changes, becomes deeper, more authoritative, unmistakably masculine. Her posture changes. Her entire demeanor shifts, and the angel delivers messages that are increasingly specific, increasingly demanding, and increasingly focused on elevating Benedetta's status within the community. The other nuns are split in their reactions. Some are genuinely awed. They've never seen anything like this, and it certainly looks supernatural. The way Benedetta transforms, the knowledge she displays when the angel speaks through her, the sheer theatrical power of these performances, it's compelling evidence that something extraordinary is happening. Others are skeptical. There's a nun named Sister Felicita who openly questions whether these visions are genuine or whether Benedetta is just very good at playing pretend. She points out that Splendidolo's messages always seem to benefit Benedetta. She notes that the angel appears most frequently when there are witnesses around to be impressed. She suggests, carefully, that maybe this is all a bit too convenient to be truly divine. Sister Felicita will eventually regret her skepticism. Not because she's wrong. History will prove her absolutely right. But because openly doubting a potential mystic in 17th century Italy is a fast track to being labeled as spiritually blind at best and heretical at worst. Benedetta, for her part, handles the skepticism brilliantly. She never defends herself directly. Instead, she lets Splendidolo do the talking. The angel, speaking through her, chastises the doubters. He warns them that questioning God's messenger is dangerous. He suggests that their skepticism reveals their own spiritual inadequacy, their own inability to recognize the divine when it's standing right in front of them. It's a perfect strategy. If Benedetta defended herself, she'd look defensive, maybe guilty. But if an angel defends her, well, that's different. That's not pride or ambition. That's just heaven setting the record straight. You watch Bartolomea during one of these performances. She's sitting near the front, her eyes wide, completely absorbed. When Splendidolo speaks through Benedetta, Bartolomea whispers prayers under her breath. When the episode ends and Benedetta collapses, Bartolomea is one of the first to rush forward, to help carry her back to her cell, to stay with her while she recovers. The bond between them is deepening. Everyone can see it. What they can't see yet is how that bond is being weaponized, how Benedetta is using her angelic authority to make demands that Bartolomea doesn't know how to refuse. Because here's the thing about Splendidolo, he doesn't just have messages for the convent. He also has specific instructions for Bartolomea. He tells her, through Benedetta, that she's been chosen too, that she has a special role to play in God's plan, that she needs to be obedient, trusting, willing to do whatever is asked of her, even if it seems strange or uncomfortable. Especially if it seems strange or uncomfortable. Because that's how you know it's really God asking. It goes against your own desires, your own comfort, your own understanding. True faith, Splenditalo insists means surrendering your will completely. Bartolomea listens. She believes. She's 18 years old, she's been in the convent for barely a year, and she's being told by an angel, through the one person she trusts most, that God has chosen her for something important. She has no idea that something important will involve nightly visits to Benedetta's cell, acts that have no names in her vocabulary, and eventually testimony before church investigators that will scandalize all of Italy. But that's still ahead. Right now, Splenditalo is just building the framework, establishing the authority, creating the theological justification for everything that's about to happen. And you're watching it unfold with the sick feeling of someone who knows how the story ends, but can't do anything to stop it. It's 1623, and something remarkable happens. Benedetta becomes abbess. At 33 years old, she's now in charge of the entire convent, the ultimate authority within these walls, the woman who makes decisions about everything from meal portions to spiritual discipline. And if you think this promotion happened through normal channels, years of service, gradual advancement, the respect of her peers, well, you'd be adorably naive. No, Benedetta's rise to power comes courtesy of her best friend and most reliable political asset, Splenditalo. The previous abbess, a woman who'd been running the convent for years with competent if uninspired efficiency, suddenly finds herself the subject of divine criticism. Splenditalo, speaking through Benedetta, begins delivering messages about leadership, about how God is displeased with the current direction of the community, about how new blood is needed, someone with genuine spiritual vision, someone who can communicate directly with heaven and lead the convent into a new era of holiness. You don't need a doctorate in theology to decode this message. Splenditalo wants Benedetta in charge. And because Splenditalo is an angel, or at least because enough people believe he's an angel, his opinion carries weight that no ordinary nun's ambition ever could. The process is Byzantine, which is appropriate given that Byzantine politics would look straightforward compared to convent power struggles. There are meetings. There are prayers for guidance. There are consultations with church authorities. The local bishop gets involved, which means reports have to be written, witnesses interviewed, Benedetta's visions examined yet again to determine their authenticity. And through it all, Benedetta maintains her perfect performance of reluctant humility. She doesn't want to be abbess, she insists. She's not worthy. She's just a simple nun trying to serve God. But if heaven is calling her to leadership, if Splenditalo is delivering clear instructions, then who is she to refuse? Disobedience to God would be the greater sin. She's trapped, really, forced by divine will to accept power she never sought. Right. Forced. The way an actor is forced to take the role they auditioned for, rehearsed for, and campaigned for behind the scenes while maintaining that they'd be just as happy staying home. The previous abbess steps down, gracefully, or as gracefully as possible when you're essentially being fired by an angel. Some of the older nuns are unhappy about this. They mutter about proper procedures, about respecting seniority, about the dangers of elevating someone so young and so prone to dramatic visions. But their muttering stays quiet. Because again, who wants to be the person arguing against God's explicit instructions? So Benedetta takes office. She moves into the abbess's larger cell, assumes the abbess's seat in the chapel, begins making the abbess's decisions. And almost immediately, things start to change. First, the rules get stricter. Longer prayer sessions, just as Splenditalo wanted, more frequent fasting, silence enforced more rigorously. The nuns who thought they were already living ascetic lives discover that Benedetta has new ideas about what asceticism really means. It's almost like she's trying to make everyone so exhausted and miserable that they won't have energy to question her authority. Second, Benedetta reorganizes the convent's social structure. She appoints certain nuns to positions of responsibility, mostly the ones who believe in her visions without question. The skeptics find themselves assigned to the worst jobs: endless laundry duty, kitchen work, cleaning the latrines. It's not explicitly punishment, of course. It's just that God has revealed to Benedetta which sisters would benefit most from humbling labor. Third, and most importantly, Benedetta tightens her control over Bartolomea. As abbess, she has the authority to assign sleeping arrangements, work duties, spiritual exercises. She arranges things so that Bartolomea is always close by, always available, always under her direct supervision. She frames it as continued mentorship, special attention for a promising young nun who needs guidance. The other nuns notice the favoritism, but favoritism isn't unusual. Abbesses often have particular nuns they rely on, assistants who help with administrative work or personal attendants who manage daily needs. In a hierarchical community like this, it's expected that the abbess would have someone close to her, someone she trusts. What they don't know yet, what Bartolomea herself is still processing, is that the relationship has crossed every possible boundary. That the spiritual exercises Benedetta prescribes happen at night, behind closed doors. That they involve bodies, not just souls. That Benedetta has found a way to transform desire into doctrine, to make abuse feel like obedience, to convince a younger woman that sex is prayer when it's commanded by someone claiming to speak for God. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in these early months of Benedetta's leadership, everything still looks plausible. A visionary nun has risen to power through divine favor. She's implementing reforms. She's demanding higher standards. She's building a reputation for the convent that's attracting attention and donations from beyond these walls. The local priests start coming by more often, wanting to witness Benedetta's ecstasies firsthand. Wealthy families make donations, hoping some of that holy favor will rub off on them. The bishop receives reports about this remarkable woman who might be a genuine mystic, and he's intrigued enough to keep watching, keep documenting, keep waiting to see if she'll prove to be a saint or something else entirely. Benedetta is riding high. She has power, prestige, a devoted follower who does whatever she asks, and a theological framework that makes all of it seem not just acceptable, but divinely ordained. She's transformed herself from an ambitious girl with convenient visions into an abbess with genuine authority, and she's done it all while maintaining that she's just following heaven's orders. It's an impressive achievement, really. You have to give her credit. In a world that gives women almost no paths to power, she's invented her own path and convinced everyone, or almost everyone, that God drew the map. The only question now is how long she can maintain the performance before something breaks. Spoiler alert, not as long as she hopes. Now we need to talk about what happens after dark. This is where the story shifts from ambitious nun with theatrical visions to something much darker, much more complicated, and much harder to wrap modern language around. Because what happens between Benedetta and Bartolomea in those nighttime hours is simultaneously sexual abuse, religious coercion, and, according to Benedetta, sacred communion commanded by heaven itself. It starts gradually. It always does. Benedetta begins summoning Bartolomea to her cell in the evenings after compline, when the other nuns have retired and the corridors are dark. At first, these visits seem innocent enough, or at least innocently explainable. They're praying together. Benedetta is providing special spiritual instruction. She's helping Bartolomea with her devotional practice, all perfectly normal activities for an abbess and her protégé. Except the prayers start lasting longer. The instruction becomes more physical. And Benedetta introduces a new element to their evening routine. She tells Bartolomea that during these sessions, she's not entirely herself. That sometimes the angel Splenditalo inhabits her body. That sometimes, and this is crucial, Jesus Christ himself takes human form and appears to them, requiring their worship in very specific, very physical ways. You need to understand the theological genius of this claim. In Catholic doctrine, Jesus is both fully divine and fully human. He had a body. He experienced physical sensations. Mystics throughout history have described their relationships with Christ in intensely embodied, often erotically charged language. The line between spiritual ecstasy and physical pleasure has always been blurry in mystical literature. Benedetta isn't inventing this tradition. She's just exploiting it more literally than most. She tells Bartolomea that Christ appears to her in male form, specifically in Benedetta's male form, because apparently Jesus finds it convenient to borrow the abbess's body for these visits. And Christ, she explains, has desires, needs. He wants to experience physical love with his brides, the nuns who have dedicated themselves to him. It's a sacred union, a holy consummation of their spiritual marriage vows. Bartolomea is confused, frightened, also profoundly indoctrinated into a worldview where disobeying religious authority means risking eternal damnation. When your abbess tells you that Jesus himself is commanding your participation in physical acts, when she's framing resistance as sinful, when she's made herself the sole interpreter of God's will in your life, what exactly are your options? So Bartolomea complies. She goes to Benedetta's cell when summoned. She participates in what Benedetta describes as spiritual exercises and what any modern person would recognize as sexual assault. She tells herself it's holy. It must be holy because Benedetta says it is, and Benedetta speaks with angels, and who is Bartolomea to question what God wants? The acts themselves, well, the records are surprisingly specific, though the church officials who later documented them tried very hard to use euphemisms. There's touching, kissing, what the investigators will delicately describe as dishonest acts and pollution. Benedetta sometimes uses objects, a piece of wood, shaped for purpose, that she claims represents Christ's physical form. She tells Bartolomea that receiving this is receiving Christ himself, that their physical union is a mystical marriage, that pleasure is proof of God's favor. It's rape dressed in liturgical language. It's abuse wrapped in theological justification. And it goes on for 2 years. 2 years of nightly summons. 2 years of Bartolomea believing, or trying to believe, that what's happening to her is sacred. 2 years of her body responding in ways that confuse and shame her, because nobody has told her that physical arousal is an involuntary response, not evidence of consent or spiritual truth. Here's what makes this even more complicated. In 17th century Italy, there isn't really a concept of lesbian sex. Sex, in the legal and theological frameworks of the time, requires penetration by a penis. Everything else is, well, it's not quite sex. It's something else. Pollution, mutual dishonesty, sins against nature, but not quite the same as sodomy or fornication. This means that what Benedetta and Bartolomea are doing exists in a weird categorical gray zone. It's clearly wrong. Any sexual activity between nuns violates their vows of chastity. But it's not clear exactly how wrong, or what category of sin it falls into, or what the appropriate punishment should be. Benedetta understands this ambiguity and uses it. She's not having sex, she argues. She's facilitating a divine encounter. Yes, there are physical elements, but those are just the embodied expressions of spiritual realities. Yes, Bartolomea experiences pleasure, but that's God's grace flowing through mortal flesh. Yes, Benedetta herself participates, but only as a vessel, only as the human form that Christ borrows to make himself tangible to his devoted bride. It's an argument that would be laughable if it weren't so effective, if it weren't keeping Bartolomea trapped, if it weren't providing Benedetta with exactly the cover she needs to continue getting what she wants. The other nuns don't know the details yet, but they're starting to notice things. Bartolomea looks exhausted. She's losing weight. She startles easily. During prayers, she sometimes spaces out completely, like her mind has gone somewhere else to escape something her body can't avoid. A few nuns hear sounds from Benedetta's cell at night, voices, movement, things that don't sound like prayer. But when they mention it to each other, they speak in whispers, and nobody wants to be the one to formally complain. Because what if it really is divine? What if Christ really is visiting their abbess? What if questioning this means questioning God himself? So they stay quiet, they watch, they worry. And Bartolomea continues making her nightly visits to Benedetta's cell, climbing the stairs with the heavy step of someone walking towards something they can't name, can't refuse, and increasingly can't survive. Something is going to break. It has to. The only question is when and how, and what will be left standing when the breaking is done. It's 1624, and Benedetta decides that visions and angelic possession aren't quite enough. She needs something more tangible, more undeniable, more physically dramatic. She needs proof written directly on her body. So, conveniently, miraculously, suspiciously, she develops stigmata. The stigmata, for anyone who slept through Catholic school, are the wounds of Christ, the holes in the hands and feet where the nails went through during crucifixion, the gash in the side where the Roman soldier's spear pierced him. Throughout Christian history, various saints have reportedly manifested these wounds spontaneously, as a sign of their intense spiritual union with Christ's suffering. Saint Francis of Assisi had them. Catherine of Siena had them. They're the ultimate credential for a mystic, the physical evidence that you're not just talking about imitating Christ, you're literally embodying his passion. So naturally, Benedetta gets them too. It happens during Holy Week, which is perfect timing from a narrative perspective. All the nuns are already focused on Christ's suffering, already deep in contemplation of the crucifixion. The mood is somber, devotional, primed for mystical experiences. Benedetta has been fasting more than usual, praying for longer hours, pushing herself into states of exhaustion that make hallucination more likely and critical thinking less so. On Good Friday, during the commemoration of Christ's death, Benedetta cries out in the chapel. You're there, you see it happen. She's kneeling before the crucifix when suddenly she gasps, doubles over, clutches her hands to her chest. The other nuns rush to her. When they pull her hands away, there's blood. Not a lot of blood, just enough to be visible, to be dramatic, to be undeniable evidence that something is happening. The blood is seeping through her palms, right where the nails would have gone. When they remove her shoes, her feet are bleeding too. And when they help her back to her cell and examine her more thoroughly, there's a wound in her side, a vertical slash that weeps blood and fluid. The convent erupts in chaos. Half the nuns are weeping with awe. The other half are terrified. Someone runs to fetch the local priest. Someone else sends word to the bishop. This is huge. This is unprecedented in this little corner of Tuscany. They might be housing a genuine saint. Benedetta, for her part, plays it perfectly. She's in pain, or at least she appears to be in considerable pain. She's weak, overwhelmed, confused about what's happening to her. She didn't ask for this, she insists. She doesn't want it. The wounds hurt terribly. She wishes God would take this burden away, but if it's His will, then she'll accept it. She'll bear her suffering as Christ bore His. It's Academy Award-level performance. The humility, the reluctance, the perfect balance of distress and acceptance. She's hitting every note that medieval and early modern spirituality associated with genuine sanctity. The wounds become the talk of the region. Word spreads beyond the convent walls. Pilgrims start showing up, wanting to see the stigmatic nun, hoping that proximity to Her Holiness might cure their illnesses or solve their problems. Donations pour in. The convent's reputation skyrockets. The bishop begins formal investigations, sending doctors and theologians to examine Benedetta and determine whether the wounds are genuine miracles or something else. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The wounds don't quite behave like normal wounds. They bleed, but not much. They don't seem to get infected, which is unusual for open sores in an era before antibiotics or even basic germ theory. They hurt, or Benedetta says they hurt, but she's still able to perform her duties as abbess, still able to move around, still able to summon Bartolomea to her cell each night for their spiritual exercises. Some of the examining physicians are impressed. Others are skeptical. One doctor notes that the wounds are suspiciously superficial, that they look more like cuts than punctures, that their edges are too clean to be spontaneous manifestations. But proving fraud is difficult. How do you prove someone is faking stigmata? Do you stake out their cell and wait to catch them cutting themselves? Do you bind their hands and see if new wounds appear? The methodology for testing miracles is, to put it mildly, underdeveloped. Benedetta knows this. She knows she's operating in a space where evidence is ambiguous, where proof is nearly impossible, where belief and skepticism are both reasonable responses to the same facts. She knows that as long as enough people believe her, the skeptics can be dismissed as lacking faith, as spiritually blind, as too worldly to recognize divine intervention. And plenty of people do believe her. The nuns who have witnessed her visions, the priests who have heard her prophecies, the pilgrims who have been healed, or convinced themselves they've been healed by proximity to Her Holiness. There's a whole economy of belief built up around Benedetta now, and too many people have invested too much to easily walk away. Bartolomea believes her too. Or at least, she's trying to believe. Because if the stigmata are real, then everything else must be real too. The angelic visions, the divine commands, the nightly visits where Christ supposedly takes physical form through Benedetta's body. If God is marking Benedetta with His wounds, then surely God is also speaking through her, acting through her, commanding Bartolomea's participation in acts that still make her skin crawl even as her body responds. The stigmata become one more tool in Benedetta's arsenal. One more layer of authority, one more reason why others should obey her, one more piece of evidence that she's special, chosen, set apart. They're also, though she doesn't realize it yet, one more thing that will eventually be used against her. Because when church investigators finally dig into her story deeply enough, they'll examine these wounds very carefully. They'll measure them, test them, document their peculiarities, and they'll conclude that Benedetta Carlini, visionary abbess and alleged saint, has been cutting herself in the dark and calling it divine intervention. But that revelation is still ahead. Right now, in 1624, with blood seeping through her palms and pilgrims gathering at the convent gates, Benedetta is at the height of her power. She has authority, reputation, physical evidence of divine favor, and a young nun who submits to her every demand because resistance would mean defying God himself. She must think she's untouchable. She must believe she's figured out the perfect system, the unassailable defense, the theological justification that makes everything permissible. She's wrong, of course, but it'll take a few more years for her to find that out. The stigmata changes everything and nothing. Benedetta now has visible proof of her sanctity, which means her authority within the convent is essentially unquestionable. And what does she do with this expanded authority? Exactly what you'd expect. She uses it to intensify her control over Bartolomea, to make her demands more explicit, and to construct increasingly elaborate theological justifications for what any reasonable person would recognize as systematic sexual abuse. The nightly visits become more frequent. What started as occasional summons, once or twice a week, evolves into an almost daily routine. After compline, after the other nuns have gone to their cells, Bartolomea makes her way through the dark corridors to Benedetta's chamber. She knocks quietly. The door opens, and for the next several hours, she participates in what Benedetta insists are sacred mysteries, divine encounters, mystical unions that transcend ordinary mortal understanding. Benedetta has refined her theological pitch. She no longer just claims that Christ appears to them. Now she has an entire cosmology worked out, a whole system of angelic hierarchies and divine commands that all somehow require Bartolomea's physical participation. Splenditalo still makes regular appearances, offering commentary and instructions. Sometimes other angels show up, Tesorito, another favorite, whose name means little treasure, and who apparently has opinions about proper devotional techniques. And then there's Jesus himself, who, according to Benedetta, takes an intense personal interest in the physical expressions of Bartolomea's love. He wants to be touched, Benedetta explains. He wants to experience the pleasures of embodied existence. He wants Bartolomea to demonstrate her devotion not just through prayer, but through active, physical engagement with his incarnated form, which, again, happens to be Benedetta's body. The logic is insane. But it's also internally consistent in a way that makes it hard to argue against if you accept the initial premises. If you believe that mystical union with Christ is the highest goal of religious life, and if you accept that this union can have physical dimensions, and if you trust that Benedetta is genuinely receiving divine communications, then you might convince yourself that what's happening is holy rather than horrific. Bartolomea is trying to convince herself. You can see it in her face during the day, the way she's constantly working through something in her mind, trying to reconcile what her body experiences at night with what her soul is supposed to feel. She's been taught her entire life that pleasure is suspect, that physical desire is dangerous, that women's bodies are sites of potential sin. But now she's being told that pleasure is proof of grace, that her body's responses are evidence of divine favor, that what feels wrong is actually the most right thing she could possibly do. It's a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Benedetta has identified every source of Bartolomea's shame and anxiety and turned them into tools of control. Bartolomea feels pleasure. That's God's blessing. She feels disgust. That's her own sinful nature resisting divine will. She wants to stop. That's evidence she needs more spiritual discipline, more instruction, more submission to the heavenly commands that only Benedetta can interpret. The physical acts themselves continue to escalate. What started as touching and kissing expands to include the wooden implement that Benedetta claims represents Christ's physical manhood. She uses it on Bartolomea, sometimes gently, sometimes roughly, always with the insistence that this is sacred, that this is worship, that accepting this object into her body is equivalent to receiving communion, to taking Christ himself into her flesh. And here's the thing that makes this even more disturbing. Benedetta seems to genuinely believe at least part of her own narrative. Or maybe she's just so committed to the performance that the line between belief and theatre has dissolved entirely. She speaks in different voices during these encounters, her own voice, Splenditelo's deeper tones, Christ's authoritative commands. She seems to enter trance states, to lose awareness of normal reality, to exist fully within the mystical drama she's constructed. Is it genuine religious ecstasy? Is it dissociation? Is it just really committed method acting? The historical record doesn't give us enough to answer definitively. What we know is that Benedetta creates a theatrical, intense, psychologically overwhelming experience that leaves Bartolomea unable to distinguish between spiritual reality and physical assault. The other nuns are starting to notice more than just Bartolomea's exhaustion. There are sounds at night, voices, movement, things breaking. There's the fact that Bartolomea and Benedetta are spending hours alone together, which violates the rule against particular friendships. There's the way Bartolomea flinches when Benedetta touches her in public, a split second of recoil before she remembers she's supposed to welcome the abbess's attention. One nun, Sister Perpetua, makes a comment during a community meeting. Nothing direct, just an observation that perhaps the abbess's special devotions with Sister Bartolomea are taking too much time away from community prayer. Perhaps it would be better for all the nuns to participate equally in spiritual exercises rather than giving one sister so much individual attention. Benedetta's response is swift and brutal. Splenditelo, speaking through her, delivers a stinging rebuke. Sister Perpetua is jealous, the angel announces. She's envious of the special graces God has given to others. Her criticism comes not from concern for the community, but from her own spiritual inadequacy, her inability to recognize divine work when it's happening right in front of her. Sister Perpetua is assigned to latrine cleaning duty for the next 6 months. The message is clear. Don't question the abbess. Don't question her relationship with Bartolomea. Don't question anything, because questioning is evidence of insufficient faith, and insufficient faith will be punished. So the other nuns stay quiet. They watch. They worry. They whisper to each other in corners where they think Benedetta can't hear them, but nobody formally complains. Nobody goes to the church authorities, because who would believe them? Benedetta has stigmata. She has visions. She has angels speaking through her. She has pilgrims showing up to venerate her, donations pouring in, a reputation that extends far beyond this convent's walls. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, night after night, Bartolomea endures what she's been taught to call divine love, and what she's beginning to suspect might be something else entirely. Her body is exhausted. Her mind is fracturing. And somewhere deep inside, in a place she can't quite access yet, a small voice is starting to whisper that maybe, just maybe, this isn't what God wants at all. That voice will eventually grow loud enough to hear, but it'll take 2 years of nightly abuse before Bartolomea finds the courage to speak it aloud. It's 1625, and the whispers in the convent are getting louder. Not loud enough to become open accusations yet, but loud enough that you can hear them if you're paying attention. And several nuns are definitely paying attention. They're watching Benedetta and Bartolomea with increasing concern, increasingly unable to ignore what their eyes and ears are telling them. increasingly caught between their desire to believe in their abbess's sanctity and their growing suspicion that something is very, very wrong. Sister Bartolomea Crivelli. You need to keep using her full name now, because there's another Bartolomea in the convent and things are about to get confusing. Looks like someone who's being slowly erased. She's lost weight, which is impressive considering the convent diet barely provides enough calories for a sedentary lifestyle, let alone whatever's happening to her at night. Her eyes have developed permanent dark circles. She jumps at sudden sounds. During communal prayers, she sometimes stops mid-psalm, her mouth still moving but no sound coming out, like she's forgotten how to make her voice work. The nuns who sleep in cells near Benedetta's chamber hear things. Voices, yes, but not the kind you'd expect from prayer. There's crying sometimes, not the devotional weeping of mystical ecstasy, but the broken sobbing of someone in distress. There's that deeper voice that's supposed to be Splenditalo or Christ, but which sounds suspiciously like Benedetta doing a bad impression of a man. There are thuds, creaking, rhythmic sounds that could be someone moving on a bed, or could be interpretive dance, or could be exactly what they sound like, which is something nobody wants to name out loud. Sister Felicita, who's never fully bought into Benedetta's mystical claims, starts documenting things. She's careful about it, keeping mental notes rather than written ones, because written evidence of doubting the abbess would be dangerous. She notes the frequency of Bartolomea's nighttime visits. She observes that these visits consistently last 3 to 4 hours. She notices that Benedetta always looks energized the next morning while Bartolomea looks destroyed. Sister Perpetua, despite her 6 months of latrine duty, hasn't been cowed into complete silence. She mentions to a few trusted nuns that perhaps someone should check on Bartolomea, that the girl seems unwell, that maybe she needs rest rather than intensive spiritual instruction. The suggestion is delicate, wrapped in concern rather than accusation, but the implication is clear. Something about Benedetta's mentorship is damaging rather than helpful. Then there's Sister Maria Margherita, who has her own history of visions and who therefore should be Benedetta's natural ally. But she's not. She watches Benedetta's performances with the skeptical eye of someone who knows how mystical theater works, and she's not impressed. She notices that Benedetta's ecstasies always happen at convenient times, always before audiences, always in ways that advance Benedetta's status or silence her critics. Real mystical experiences, in Sister Maria Margherita's view, are messier, less controlled, less obviously strategic. These three, Felicita, Perpetua, and Maria Margherita, start having quiet conversations. Nothing formal, nothing that could be reported as conspiracy or rebellion. Just concerned discussions about the welfare of a younger nun, about whether the abbess's methods are truly appropriate, about whether anyone has a responsibility to do something even if doing something means challenging divine authority. The problem is evidence, or rather, the lack of it. They hear sounds, they see exhaustion, they notice the special treatment and the long private hours. But they don't know what's actually happening behind Benedetta's closed door. And in 17th century Italy, you can't exactly install surveillance cameras or demand that the abbess's private spiritual exercises be supervised. More importantly, they're up against the stigmata. Those wounds on Benedetta's hands and feet and side are powerful evidence that God has marked her as special. How do you accuse someone of abuse when they've been visibly chosen by heaven? How do you suggest that an abbess with stigmata might be using her authority inappropriately? The wounds make Benedetta essentially immune to normal criticism. Or so it seems. What these skeptical nuns don't realize yet is that the stigmata will eventually become evidence for the prosecution rather than the defense, but that's years away. Right now, the wounds are still working in Benedetta's favor, still providing cover for everything else she's doing. Meanwhile, Bartolomea is trapped between two impossible positions. On one hand, she's starting to understand, somewhere deep in her consciousness where she can't quite examine it directly yet, that what's happening to her isn't divine. Her body knows this even if her mind won't admit it. The way her stomach clenches when Benedetta summons her. The way she dissociates during the encounters, sending her mind somewhere else while her body endures. The way she sometimes catches herself praying desperately for the visits to stop, then feeling guilty for that prayer, because if they're holy, then asking them to stop is asking God to stop loving her. On the other hand, she genuinely believes, or has been conditioned to believe, that Benedetta speaks for heaven. If Splenditolo says these acts are sacred, who is Bartolomea to disagree with an angel? If Christ himself commands her participation, isn't refusal the greater sin? She's caught in a theological trap with no obvious escape route. The nuns who are beginning to suspect the truth want to help her, but they don't know how to ask the right questions. How do you ask a young nun if her abbess is sexually abusing her when nobody has the vocabulary for lesbian sex? When the acts themselves exist in a categorical gray zone, when the abuse is wrapped so thoroughly in religious language that unwrapping it feels like heresy? Sister Felicita tries once. She finds Bartolomea in the garden, supposedly weeding but actually just sitting motionless, staring at nothing. Felicita sits down beside her, makes small talk about the vegetables, then carefully suggests that if Bartolomea ever needs to talk about anything, if there's anything troubling her about her spiritual exercises with the abbess, Felicita would be willing to listen without judgment. Bartolomea looks at her with eyes that are simultaneously desperate and dead. For a moment, you think she might speak, might break open, might let the truth come spilling out. But then she blinks, and the moment passes, and she says in a flat voice that everything is fine, the abbess is very holy, the spiritual exercises are a blessing, she's grateful for the attention. Felicita doesn't push. She can't. Because if Bartolomea reports this conversation to Benedetta, Felicita will be punished for planting doubts, for interfering with the abbess's authority, for potentially obstructing divine work. So Felicita retreats. The skeptical nuns continue their quiet observations. Bartolomea continues her nightly visits, and Benedetta continues building her empire of imposed sanctity, apparently confident that her combination of mystical credentials and psychological manipulation will keep her safe indefinitely. What none of them know yet is that events beyond the convent walls are about to force everything into the open. Because while these domestic dramas are playing out, church authorities have been conducting their own investigation. They've been interviewing nuns, examining the stigmata, reviewing reports from priests who have visited the convent. And they're starting to have serious doubts. We need to talk about the most audacious part of Benedetta's theology, her claim that Jesus Christ himself physically manifests in her cell, borrowing her body, and requires Bartolomea's sexual service as an act of worship. Because even in a religious tradition that includes plenty of mystical weirdness, this is pushing the boundaries of what's theologically acceptable into territory that makes church authorities deeply, profoundly nervous. It's around 1625, and Benedetta's explanations for the nightly encounters are becoming more elaborate. It's no longer enough to say that the acts are spiritually significant. Now she's developed a full narrative about divine incarnation, about how Christ occasionally needs to experience physical existence, about how loving him properly requires engaging with his embodied form. Here's how she explains it to Bartolomea. Christ, being fully God and fully human, contains within himself all human experiences and desires. During his earthly life, he experienced hunger, thirst, pain, joy. He had a body that needed food and rest. And according to Benedetta's increasingly creative interpretation of theology, he also had, and continues to have, sexual desires that require satisfaction. Now, Orthodox Christian theology would have some serious objections to this claim. Jesus is traditionally understood as celibate, as having transcended physical desire, as being interested in souls rather than bodies when it comes to his relationship with believers. The mystical marriage between Christ and the soul is supposed to be metaphorical, or at least spiritual rather than literal. But Benedetta argues that the mystical marriage should be consummated just like earthly marriages. She claims that Christ appears to her, speaks through her, and uses her body as a temporary vessel so he can physically unite with his beloved brides. When she touches Bartolomea, it's not really Benedetta touching her, it's Jesus. When she uses the wooden implement, it's not really a piece of carved wood, it's Christ's actual flesh, made tangible through divine power. The theological gymnastics required to make this work are impressive. She's essentially arguing for a reverse transubstantiation, where instead of bread becoming Christ's body, her body becomes Christ's body, or sometimes Splenditelo's body, or occasionally other angels' bodies. The whole system is flexible enough that Benedetta can claim divine authorization for whatever she wants to do, while maintaining that she herself is just a passive vessel, innocent of any wrongdoing because she's not acting of her own will. It's brilliant and horrifying in equal measure. She's created a theological framework that makes her simultaneously all-powerful and blameless. She can do whatever she wants to Bartolomea because it's not really her doing it, it's heaven working through her. And if Bartolomea resists or complains, she's not resisting Benedetta, she's resisting God himself. The specifics of these divine visitations follow a predictable pattern. After compline, Bartolomea arrives at Benedetta's cell. Benedetta is usually already in an altered state, eyes unfocused, voice changed, claiming that the transformation has begun. She announces who's currently inhabiting her body. Sometimes it's Christ, sometimes it's Splenditelo. The identity shifts depending on what Benedetta wants to do that night and which divine figure provides the best justification. If it's Christ, the encounter is framed as sacred marriage. Bartolomea is the bride, he is the bridegroom, and their physical union is a reenactment of the mystical marriage described in the Song of Songs. Never mind that the Song of Songs is poetry, metaphor, allegory. Never mind that every reputable theologian interprets it spiritually, rather than literally. Benedetta insists on the literal reading because the literal reading lets her do what she wants. If it's Splenditelo, the encounter is framed as angelic instruction. The angel is teaching Bartolomea about divine love, showing her how to properly worship, training her body to be a more perfect vessel for God's grace. The fact that this instruction involves Bartolomea's genitals is just evidence of how thoroughly divine love must permeate every aspect of human existence. During these encounters, Benedetta speaks in her divine voice, that deeper, masculine tone she's developed for when angels or Christ are supposedly speaking through her. She gives commands, touch here, kiss there, receive this, accept that. She describes what Christ or the angels are feeling, what they're experiencing through her borrowed body, how pleased they are with Bartolomea's obedience. And Bartolomea, caught in this elaborate performance, has no framework for understanding it as anything other than what Benedetta claims it is. She's never heard anyone suggest that authority figures might lie about divine commands. She's never been taught that religious experiences can be manufactured rather than genuine. She's never learned that her own bodily autonomy matters more than obedience to supposed heavenly orders. So she endures. She participates. She tries to make sense of why divine love feels so much like violation, why sacred union leaves her feeling hollowed out rather than filled with grace, why Christ's touch through Benedetta's hands makes her skin crawl even as her body responds in ways she can't control. Here's something the historical records reveal. Benedetta isn't the first person to make these kinds of claims. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, there are scattered accounts of religious figures, mostly but not exclusively women, who claimed that divine beings required sexual acts as forms of worship. Most of these claims were quickly identified as demonic deception or outright fraud. The Church had developed pretty strict guidelines about what legitimate mystical experiences looked like, and God wants you to have sex with me generally didn't make the approved list. What's unusual about Benedetta is how long she gets away with it. 2 full years of nightly abuse before anyone outside the convent learns the details. Part of this is her skill at manipulation. Part is the stigmata providing cover. Part is the general difficulty of investigating convents, which are supposed to be closed, private communities where outsiders don't interfere. But mostly, it's that Bartolomea doesn't tell anyone. And she doesn't tell anyone because Benedetta has convinced her that there's nothing to tell, or rather, that what's happening is so sacred that speaking about it to others would be a betrayal of divine confidence. Benedetta warns her constantly. These experiences are special, secret, meant only for those pure enough to receive them. If Bartolomea speaks about them to the other nuns, they won't understand. They'll be jealous or scandalized. They might try to stop the divine work that's happening. They might separate Benedetta and Bartolomea, ending the special relationship that heaven has ordained. It's classic abuser logic. Isolate the victim, convince them that the abuse is special, frame any attempt to get help as betrayal. And it works. It works for 2 solid years until finally, something in Bartolomea breaks and she finds the strength to speak. But we're not there yet. Right now, Christ is still supposedly visiting nightly, still requiring Bartolomea's participation in acts she can't name and can't refuse. Right now, Benedetta's theological creativity is still providing cover for what any reasonable observer would recognize as systematic rape. Right now, heaven is being used as a weapon, and nobody seems able to stop it. Let's talk about Benedetta's public performances, because what happens behind closed doors with Bartolomea is only half the story. The other half is the elaborate show Benedetta stages for the entire convent, for visiting priests, for church investigators, and eventually, for anyone willing to believe that they are witnessing genuine mystical phenomena rather than carefully choreographed theater. The ecstasies follow a pattern. They almost always happen when there's an audience, during communal prayer, at mealtimes when all the nuns are gathered, during visits from important church officials. Benedetta never has a convenient private ecstasy that goes unwitnessed. She understands that mystical experiences are only valuable if people see them, talk about them, remember them. Here's how a typical episode unfolds. You're in the chapel for Vespers. Everything is proceeding normally. Psalms, prayers, the usual rhythm of devotion. Then Benedetta gasps. It's always a gasp first, that sharp intake of breath that makes everyone look up from their prayer books. Her body goes rigid. Her eyes roll back or fix on some invisible point in the middle distance. Her hands start trembling. Sometimes she stays in her seat, frozen in this posture of supernatural encounter. Other times she stands, staggers, moves in ways that look uncontrolled, but which, if you watch carefully, never quite result in actual injury. She'll collapse dramatically, but somehow always manage to fall in ways that are theatrical rather than dangerous. No broken bones, no serious bruises, just enough impact to look genuine without causing real harm. Then the voice changes. That deep, masculine tone she's developed takes over. It might be Splenditalo delivering a message. It might be Christ himself speaking. The content varies, but the themes are consistent. The convent needs to be more devout. Benedetta is God's chosen vessel. Doubters are spiritually blind. Everyone should submit more completely to divine will as interpreted by the abbess. Sometimes she speaks in Latin. And this is where things get interesting, because Benedetta's Latin isn't particularly good under normal circumstances. But during Ecstasies, she manages to produce complex theological statements in relatively fluent Latin. Skeptics might point out that she's had years of exposure to Latin prayers and liturgy, that her brain could reproduce phrases she's heard without fully understanding them. Believers counter that the sophistication of her Latin during Ecstasies proves supernatural intervention. The physicality of these episodes is genuinely unsettling, even if you don't believe they're divine. Benedetta convulses, her body racked by what look like seizures or spasms. She weeps uncontrollably, producing tears and mucus and saliva in quantities that suggest genuine autonomic distress. Her skin flushes or goes pale. Her breathing becomes rapid and shallow, or sometimes so slow it seems like she might stop breathing altogether. Modern neurologists looking at historical descriptions of these episodes might diagnose various things: epilepsy, dissociative disorders, psychogenic seizures, or simply very skilled voluntary control of autonomic functions. Some people can, with practice, alter their heart rate, breathing, and other supposedly involuntary responses. Performance artists and method actors develop similar skills. Stage magicians have been faking trance states for centuries. But in 1625, none of these explanations are available. The only frameworks people have are divine ecstasy, demonic possession, or deliberate fraud. And determining which is surprisingly difficult when the person experiencing or performing the episode is also the primary source of information about what's happening. After the dramatic peak of the ecstasy, there's always a wind-down period. Benedetta slowly returns to herself, looking exhausted and disoriented. She claims she doesn't remember what happened, what she said, what the angels or Christ communicated through her. Other nuns have to tell her, and she always responds with appropriate humility. "Oh, did I really say that? How remarkable. I'm just a vessel. I have no idea why God chooses to work through someone as unworthy as me." It's a perfect defense. If the messages are problematic, she didn't say them. Heaven did. If they're beneficial to her, well, she's just reporting what happened. She maintains plausible deniability while reaping all the benefits of divine authority. The nuns' responses to these performances vary. Some are genuinely moved, convinced they are witnessing miracles. They weep along with Benedetta, pray more fervently, feel blessed to be part of a community where God speaks so directly. These are usually the younger nuns, the more naive ones, or those who desperately want to believe their lives have transcendent meaning beyond endless needlework and thin soup. Others are more skeptical, but keep their doubts private. They've seen enough of life to recognize performance when they see it. They notice the convenient timing of the ecstasies, the way they always support Benedetta's interests, the suspicious lack of prophetic messages that would actually be useful, like warning about the plague that's coming in a few years, or predicting political events that haven't happened yet. And then there's a third group, nuns who are disturbed not by skepticism, but by the opposite. They believe the ecstasies are supernatural, but they're not sure the supernatural force involved is divine. They wonder if what they're witnessing might be demonic possession masquerading as holy visions. They note that demons are clever, that Satan can quote scripture, that false prophets are warned about throughout the Bible. These nuns pay attention to details. They notice that Benedetta's ecstasies often involve her demanding special privileges, relaxed rules for herself, authority over others. They remember that genuine saints usually became more humble and obedient through their mystical experiences, not more powerful and controlling. They observe that Benedetta's visions never inconvenience her, never require her to make genuine sacrifices, never challenge her in ways that would suggest an external divine will rather than her own desires wearing a holy disguise. Sister Maria Margherita, who has her own history of visions, is particularly attuned to these discrepancies. She's experienced genuine altered states, and what Benedetta doesn't feel the same. There's something too controlled about it, too performative. Real mystical ecstasy in her experience is messier, more unpredictable, less conveniently timed. It happens when you don't want it to, disrupts your plans, embarrasses you in front of people you're trying to impress. Benedetta's ecstasies, by contrast, seem to happen exactly when they'll have maximum impact, when important visitors arrive, when there's dissent brewing that needs to be quashed, when Benedetta needs to reassert her authority or distract from questions about her relationship with Bartolomea. But Sister Maria Margherita can't prove any of this. She can't climb inside Benedetta's head and determine what's genuine and what's performance. She can't distinguish between skilled acting and legitimate mystical phenomena when both produce similar external symptoms. All she can do is watch, document mentally, and wait for Benedetta to make a mistake significant enough that even believers will have to acknowledge something is wrong. That mistake is coming. But first, there will be 2 more years of performances, of escalating claims, of Benedetta pushing the boundaries of what people will accept as divine intervention. And throughout it all, Bartolomea will sit in the audience, watching her abuser perform sanctity, unable to reconcile the woman who claims to speak for God with the woman who violates her nightly in the name of divine love. It's 1626, and something fundamental shifts in Bartolomea Crivelli. Not all at once. There's no single dramatic moment of clarity where everything suddenly makes sense. Instead, it's like a crack forming in ice, barely visible at first, then spreading slowly until the entire frozen surface becomes unstable. For 2 years, she's endured the nightly visits, convinced herself they're holy, suppressed every instinct that screams otherwise. And now, finally, something in her breaks open enough to let the truth seep through. What changes? It's hard to say exactly. Maybe it's cumulative exhaustion. 2 years of sleep deprivation and psychological trauma finally overwhelming her ability to maintain the fiction. Maybe it's something specific that happens during one of the encounters, some act that's finally too much for her theological justifications to contain. Maybe it's just that she's older now, 21 instead of 19, and that small increment of maturity gives her enough distance to see what's been happening to her. Or maybe, and this seems likely from the historical records, she talks to someone outside the convent who helps her understand that what she's experiencing isn't normal, isn't holy, isn't something she has to accept. Convents weren't completely sealed off from the world. Families could visit. Priests came regularly to hear confessions. There were servants, delivery people, occasional outside workers doing repairs or maintenance. These interactions were supervised, conducted through grills or in the presence of chaperones, but conversation was possible. Information could flow. The records suggest that Bartolomea might have spoken with her father during a family visit. Just a brief conversation through the visiting room grill, but enough for her to hint that something is wrong, that she's unhappy, that the abbess's spiritual exercises are causing her distress. Her father, not being bound by convent politics or religious awe of Benedetta's reputation, apparently responded with appropriate paternal outrage rather than pious acceptance. He may have said something simple but revolutionary. You don't have to accept this. What she's doing to you isn't holy. You have the right to refuse. These ideas, that Bartolomea has rights, that obedience to authority isn't absolute, that religious language can mask abuse, are apparently new to her. Or at least, they've never been articulated clearly enough for her to grasp them. But once someone says them out loud, once the possibility enters her consciousness that Benedetta might be lying about divine commands, the entire theological structure that's been keeping Bartolomea compliant starts to crumble. She begins refusing the summons to Benedetta's cell. Not openly at first, she's too frightened for that. She develops convenient illnesses on nights when she knows Benedetta will call for her. Sudden stomach ailments, headaches, women's troubles that nobody wants to discuss in detail. Benedetta, frustrated but unable to force a genuinely sick nun to leave her cell, has to let these absences slide. But Benedetta isn't stupid. She recognizes resistance when she sees it. And her response is to escalate. More divine commands, more explicit threats about the spiritual consequences of disobedience, more manipulation about how disappointing Christ is in Bartolomea's wavering devotion. When Bartolomea continues to resist, Benedetta plays her trump card. She claims that Christ himself is angry about Bartolomea's disobedience, that the angels are disappointed, that Bartolomea's soul is in danger of damnation if she doesn't return to proper submission. She even suggests that Bartolomea might be under demonic influence, that her resistance is evidence of Satan working to destroy the holy relationship between them. It's psychological warfare dressed in religious language, and it might have worked, except that Bartolomea has now had a taste of an alternative narrative. She's heard someone suggest that maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't her disobedience but Benedetta's abuse. And once you've heard that possibility, it's very hard to unhear it. The breaking point comes during confession. Bartolomea goes to confession with one of the visiting priests, not Father Paolo, who's been Benedetta's supporter and essentially her chaplain, but a different priest who rotates through to hear the nuns' confessions. She's in the confessional booth, that dark enclosed space that's supposed to be safe, supposed to be confidential, supposed to be where you can tell the truth without fear. And finally, hesitantly, using words she barely has, Bartolomea begins to describe what's been happening to her. She doesn't call it rape. She doesn't have that word, not for this. Rape is what soldiers do to women during war, what bandits do to travelers, what happens in dark alleys between strangers. This is something different, something she doesn't have language for. So instead, she describes acts, physical details. The things Benedetta does to her body while claiming to be inhabited by Christ or angels. The wooden implement. The touching. The commands to reciprocate, to participate, to demonstrate her love through physical submission. The priest is initially confused. He's hearing about acts that don't quite fit any category of sin he's prepared for. They're not the usual confessional fare, anger, pride, laziness, unkind thoughts about other nuns. They're not even the sexual sins he occasionally hears about: self-pollution, impure thoughts, inappropriate touching between nuns. This is something else. This is an abbess claiming divine authority for acts that sound decidedly non-divine. This is mystical experience twisted into something that makes his theological training send up warning signals. He asks careful questions. Who initiates these acts? Benedetta. Who claims they're commanded by heaven? Benedetta. Who benefits from maintaining that they're holy rather than sinful? Benedetta. Does Bartolomea want these encounters to continue? No. Has she tried to refuse? Yes. What happens when she refuses? Threats of damnation, accusations of disobedience to God, punishment through Benedetta's administrative authority. The priest is beginning to understand. This isn't mystical union. This is abuse wrapped in enough theological language to make the victim complicit in her own victimization. He tells Bartolomea, and this must feel like the sky opening up, like the first real breath after 2 years of drowning, that she's not sinning by refusing these acts. That obedience to an abbess doesn't override her right to bodily integrity. That if Benedetta is truly receiving divine commands, those commands wouldn't require secrecy, wouldn't cause such obvious distress, wouldn't align so perfectly with one person's desires at another person's expense. It's not a complete validation. The priest still frames things in terms of spiritual warfare and appropriate religious authority rather than sexual abuse and consent. But it's enough. It's permission to resist. It's acknowledgement that what's been happening to her isn't her fault, isn't evidence of her spiritual weakness, isn't something she deserves. Bartolomea leaves the confessional with something she hasn't had in 2 years: clarity. The theological fog that's been obscuring her reality is beginning to lift. And underneath it, she can finally see what's been happening to her for exactly what it is. She's not ready to testify publicly yet. She's not ready to stand before church investigators and describe everything in detail. But the silence has cracked. The truth is beginning to emerge. And once truth starts moving, it's very hard to push it back into whatever dark corner it's been hiding in. Benedetta doesn't know it yet, but her performance is about to end. The curtain is coming down, and when it does, everyone will finally see what's been happening backstage while the audience applauded the show. The confession sets everything in motion. The priest who heard Bartolomea's testimony doesn't rush immediately to the authorities. He's careful, methodical, aware that accusing a stigmatic abbess of sexual misconduct is the kind of thing that can destroy careers if handled badly. But he does report what he's heard to his superiors. He writes careful letters to the episcopal office in Pescia. He documents dates, describes the nature of the allegations, and recommends a formal investigation. By early 1626, church investigators arrive at the convent. Not the friendly visiting priests who have been coming to witness Benedetta's ecstasies and marvel at her stigmata. These are different men, papal representatives with authority to question nuns under oath, to examine physical evidence, to determine whether what's happening in this convent represents genuine mystical phenomena. or something much darker. The nuns know something serious is happening when they're called one by one to give testimony. The investigators set up in the convent's visiting room, creating a makeshift tribunal. Each nun is questioned separately, asked about Benedetta's visions, her stigmata, her relationship with Bartolomea, any unusual behaviors or suspicious circumstances they've observed. Sister Felicita finally gets to voice her doubts. She describes the sounds from Benedetta's cell at night, the exhausted state of Bartolomea, the convenient timing of the mystical episodes. Sister Perpetua corroborates, adding observations about how Benedetta's messages from heaven always seem to benefit Benedetta's earthly interest. Sister Maria Margherita provides the perspective of someone who's had genuine mystical experiences and finds Benedetta's performances unconvincing by comparison. But the crucial testimony comes from Bartolomea herself. She's terrified. You can see it in how her hands shake when she's called to testify, how her voice barely rises above a whisper. The investigators have to keep asking her to speak up, to repeat herself, to clarify details that are obviously painful to discuss. She describes everything. The nightly summons that began 2 years ago, the gradual escalation from prayer to touching to explicit sexual acts. The theological justifications Benedetta provided, claims that Christ was inhabiting her body, that angels commanded Bartolomea's participation, that physical pleasure was evidence of divine grace. The wooden implement shaped like a phallus that Benedetta used, claiming it represented Christ's flesh made manifest. The hours spent in Benedetta's cell, participating in acts that Bartolomea had no words for, acts that left her feeling hollowed out and ashamed even as Benedetta insisted they were holy. The investigators are simultaneously shocked and careful in their documentation. They ask explicit questions: who did what to whom, how often, in what positions, using what objects. They need details because details are how you distinguish between vague accusations and provable misconduct. Bartolomea provides those details, crying through much of her testimony, but forcing herself to speak because finally, someone is listening, someone believes her, someone recognizes that what happened to her was wrong. Other nuns are questioned about what they witnessed. Did they see Bartolomea entering Benedetta's cell at night? Yes. Did they hear sounds suggesting sexual activity? Some did. Did Benedetta ever speak about these encounters? Not directly, but she made references to special spiritual exercises with Bartolomea, to teachings that only certain pure souls could receive, to mystical unions that transcended ordinary understanding. Then the investigators turn their attention to the stigmata. They examine Benedetta's wounds carefully, measuring them, testing their depth, observing how they bleed or don't bleed under various conditions. They compare notes with previous medical examinations. And they begin to notice inconsistencies. The wounds are superficial, cuts rather than punctures, located in positions that Benedetta could easily reach herself. They don't behave like spontaneous, miraculous manifestations. They look, the physicians conclude, like self-inflicted injuries carefully maintained to appear supernatural. One investigator even finds what might be a small knife hidden in Benedetta's cell, though she claims it's just for cutting thread for embroidery work. Benedetta, called to testify, maintains her innocence with impressive conviction. The acts with Bartolomea weren't her doing, they were Christ's. She was merely the vessel, the innocent intermediary through which divine will was enacted. If Bartolomea now claims distress, that's evidence of demonic interference corrupting what was originally holy. the wounds on her hands and feet. Divine gifts that she never sought, burdens she bears reluctantly for God's glory. She's still performing, still insisting on her mystical authority, still trying to maintain the theological framework that's protected her for years. But this time, her audience isn't sympathetic. The investigators have heard too many stories like this. False mystics claiming divine authority for earthly desires. Women using religious language to mask prohibited behaviors. Supposed saints whose sanctity conveniently excuses them from rules that bind everyone else. The investigation takes months. Witness statements are compiled, cross-referenced, analyzed. Medical experts examine the stigmata repeatedly. Theologians review Benedetta's claimed visions and prophecies, checking them against church doctrine and finding numerous problematic elements. The fact that Christ supposedly manifested physically to engage in sexual acts is particularly damning. It's a claim that borders on heresy, suggesting that divinity participates in carnal pleasure in ways that contradict fundamental doctrines about Christ's nature. By late 1626, the investigators reach their conclusions. The stigmata are fraudulent, self-inflicted wounds maintained through repeated cutting. The visions are either delusions or deliberate fabrications. The mystical marriage with Christ is a blasphemous fiction used to justify sexual abuse. Benedetta Carlini is not a saint. She's not even a legitimate mystic. She's a fraud, an abuser, and quite possibly possessed by demonic forces that masqueraded as divine ones to lead her and others into sin. The verdict is careful in its language, but devastating in its implications. Benedetta is guilty of pretense of sanctity, faking mystical experiences for personal gain. She's guilty of carnal relations with another nun, violating her vows of chastity. She's guilty of abuse of authority, using her position as abbess to coerce a younger nun into sexual acts. She's guilty of heresy, attributing to Christ actions and desires that contradict fundamental theological teachings. The recommended punishment is severe: removal from office, perpetual imprisonment within the convent, prohibition from holding any position of authority, and regular spiritual discipline to cleanse her of whatever demonic influences led her astray. Benedetta protests. She appeals to higher authorities. She claims the investigation is tainted by jealousy and spiritual blindness. She insists that future events will vindicate her, that God will reveal the truth, that those who doubt her will be proven wrong. But the Church has made its decision. The performance is over. The audience has left. And Benedetta Carlini, who spent years building an empire of imposed sanctity, is about to discover what happens when that empire collapses. The sentencing happens in 1627, and it's designed to be both punishment and erasure. Benedetta is stripped of her position as abbess. That much is immediate and public. A new abbess is appointed, someone older, more conventional, someone who will restore order and proper hierarchy to a convent that's been destabilized by years of theatrical mysticism and abuse. Benedetta is moved to a smaller cell, one without any of the privileges she enjoyed as abbess. And then comes the truly devastating part. She's sentenced to remain imprisoned within the convent for the rest of her natural life. It's a strange kind of punishment when you think about it. She's already in a convent, already cloistered, already separated from the wider world. But now that separation becomes total. She's not allowed to participate in community activities beyond required prayers. She can't speak to visitors. She can't hold any office or responsibility. She exists in the same physical space as the other nuns but is functionally invisible, erased from the social life of the community. For someone like Benedetta, someone who built her entire identity around being seen, being special, being the center of divine attention, this erasure is perhaps worse than death. She's alive but irrelevant, present but powerless. Still breathing the same air as the women she once controlled, but now utterly without authority over any of them. The other nuns adjust to the new reality with varying degrees of ease. Some, particularly the younger ones who believed in Benedetta's sanctity, are shattered. Their entire spiritual framework has been revealed as fraudulent. The woman they thought was a living saint turns out to be a fraud and an abuser. It's the kind of betrayal that makes you question everything. If you were wrong about this, what else might you be wrong about? If religious authority can be faked so convincingly, how do you trust anything? Others, like Sister Felicita and Sister Perpetua, feel vindicated but also somehow hollow. They were right to be suspicious, right to document and observe and doubt. But being right doesn't feel particularly good when you've watched someone be systematically abused for 2 years and couldn't stop it because you lacked the authority or evidence to intervene effectively. Bartolomea recovers slowly, incompletely. The trauma doesn't just disappear because someone in authority finally acknowledged it happened. She's 22 years old and will spend the rest of her life processing what was done to her. She remains in the convent. She has nowhere else to go, and leaving would require resources and permissions she doesn't have. So she stays, living in the same building as her abuser, passing her occasionally in corridors or chapel, trying to rebuild some sense of self that wasn't shaped entirely by violation disguised as divine love. The church investigators file their reports and move on to other cases. There's always another nun claiming visions, another priest accused of misconduct, another monastery with financial irregularities. Benedetta's case becomes a footnote, a cautionary tale that gets mentioned in seminaries when teaching about how to distinguish genuine mystical phenomena from fraud. The details are too scandalous to discuss openly, so the story gets sanitized, reduced to a nun who faked stigmata and abused her authority. The sexual component, the specifically lesbian nature of the abuse, gets buried in euphemisms and strategic omissions. Because here's the uncomfortable truth, the church doesn't quite know what to do with this case. If Benedetta had been a male priest abusing female parishioners, the framework for understanding and punishing that behavior exists. If she had been engaging in heterosexual fornication, that's another familiar category of sin with established penalties. But lesbian sex between nuns, that exists in a categorical limbo. It's sinful, certainly. It violates chastity vows. But it's not quite sodomy in the traditional legal sense, not quite adultery, not quite any of the sexual sins that canon law has clear procedures for addressing. So the punishment is improvised, cobbled together from various precedents about fraud, abuse of authority, and general sexual misconduct. And then everyone involved tries very hard to forget about it and move on. Benedetta lives in her cell prison for 35 more years. 35 years of enforced silence and invisibility. 35 years of watching younger nuns come and go, watching abbesses rise and fall, watching the convent life continue without her participation. She's fed, clothed, allowed to attend required prayers. But she's functionally dead to the community while her body continues living. Does she ever admit fault? Does she ever acknowledge that the visions were fabricated, that the mystical experiences were performances, that what she did to Bartolomea was rape rather than divine communion. The records don't tell us. She might have maintained her innocence until the end, convinced either that she was genuinely right or that admitting fraud would be the final destruction of whatever self-concept she'd managed to preserve. Or she might have had long, quiet years to reflect on what she'd done and come to some understanding of the harm she'd caused. We'll never know. What we do know is that she dies in 1661, still imprisoned in the convent, still officially condemned as a fraud and abuser. She's 65 years old. She's buried in the convent cemetery without ceremony or recognition, no marker celebrating her as a mystic, no acknowledgement of the years she spent as abbess. Just a grave among other graves, notable now only because historians would later uncover her story and recognize it as one of the most extensively documented cases of female same-sex relations in early modern Europe. Bartolomea outlives her by several years. She remains in the convent until her own death, living a quiet life of prayer and work, never holding significant office, never drawing attention to herself. The records don't tell us whether she ever fully recovered from the trauma, whether she ever formed healthy relationships with other women, whether she ever stopped having nightmares about the sound of footsteps approaching her cell at night. We can hope she found some measure of peace, but hope is all we have. The convent itself continues for several more centuries before eventually being dissolved in reforms that swept through Italy. The building still exists. You can visit it if you're ever in Pescia, though it's been converted to other uses. The walls that contained Benedetta's performance and Bartolomea's suffering are still standing, indifferent to the dramas they once enclosed. And the documents, the investigation records, the testimony, the careful documentation of acts that 17th century scribes could barely bring themselves to describe. They survive in church archives, gathering dust for 300 years, until a historian named Judith Brown discovers them in the 1980s and brings Benedetta's story back into public consciousness. Brown's book, Immodest Acts, finally gives this story the analysis it deserves. She situates it in the context of early modern religious life, female mysticism, and the ways that women in severely constrained circumstances found paths to power, even when those paths involved causing tremendous harm. She gives us back Benedetta as a complex figure, not a simple victim of patriarchal oppression, not a straightforward villain, but a person who navigated impossible constraints with intelligence and ruthlessness, who found ways to get what she wanted even when what she wanted meant destroying someone else. And she gives us back Bartolomea, too, no longer just a footnote in Benedetta's story, but a person in her own right. Someone who survived. Someone who found the courage to speak when speaking meant challenging divine authority. Someone who reminds us that even in the most oppressive systems, even when language and framework for understanding abuse barely exist, victims can still find ways to name what's been done to them and demand accountability. The story ends in a convent in Pescia, with two women who will never be more than fragments in historical records, who lived and suffered and died in a world that didn't have adequate language for their experiences. It ends with questions that can't be fully answered, with ambiguities that can't be resolved, with a recognition that human behavior in extreme circumstances produces outcomes too complex for simple moral judgments. Benedetta Carlini was an abuser. She was also a woman with almost no legitimate paths to power who created her own through the only means available to her. She was brilliant and cruel and damaged and damaging. She was a product of a system that gave women only two choices: marriage, or convent, and then controlled them absolutely within whichever option they chose. She was a fraud who might have started with genuine mystical experiences before performance took over. She was everything and nothing that the people around her believed her to be, and her story, finally told in full, reminds us that the past is never as simple as we want it to be. That abuse and power and desire and faith get tangled together in ways that defy easy categorization. That even in the most religiously constrained environments, human sexuality finds expression. That women have always been more complex, more capable of both heroism and villainy than the systems containing them wanted to acknowledge. The lesbian mystic of Pescia claimed sacred seduction. What she actually practiced was sacred violation. And 300 years later, we're still trying to understand how both those things could be true at once. How someone could genuinely believe in their own holiness while systematically destroying another person. How faith and fraud could be so thoroughly intertwined that separating them becomes impossible. The candles in the convent chapel have long since burned down. The prayers have faded into silence. The women who lived this story are centuries dead. But the questions they raise, about power, about belief, about what happens when religious authority becomes a weapon, those questions remain alive, urgent, impossible to ignore. And maybe that's the real ending, not resolution, but recognition. Not answers, but better questions. Not closure, but the acknowledgement that some stories don't close neatly, that some truths are too complicated for comfort, that history gives us not lessons but reflections of ourselves in circumstances we hope never to face. And so the story ends, not with trumpets or divine intervention, but with the quiet settling of dust in archives, with women's voices fading into the centuries, with stone walls that remember everything and nothing at all. You've traveled a long way tonight. Through convent corridors lit by candles that guttered out 300 years ago. Through theological arguments that twisted desire into doctrine. Through the particular darkness of abuse wrapped in the language of heaven. It's been heavy, hasn't it? The weight of someone else's suffering, someone else's calculated cruelty, someone else's impossible choices in a world that gave women almost no choices at all. But now, it's time to let it go. Time to release Benedetta and Bartolomea back to their rest. Time to step away from 17th century Pescia and return to your own warm bed, your own soft pillow, your own life where you have freedoms those women couldn't imagine and safety they never knew. Breathe in slowly. Hold it. Release. The convent walls are fading now, dissolving like morning mist. The sound of bells calling nuns to prayer grows distant, then disappears entirely. The stone floors, the narrow cells, the chapel where so many performances unfolded, all of it receding, becoming memory, becoming history, becoming something that happened long ago to people who can't be hurt anymore because they're beyond all hurting now. You're here, in your bed, in your time. Safe. The night outside your window is peaceful. No investigations coming. No testimonies required. No authorities demanding explanations for desires that have no name. Just darkness, gentle and complete, wrapping around you like a blanket woven from silence and stars. Let your body sink deeper into the mattress. Feel how it supports you, how gravity pulls you down into comfort rather than into stone floors worn smooth by centuries of kneeling. Feel how your muscles release, one by one, letting go of tension you didn't know you were carrying. Your jaw unclenches, your shoulders drop, your hands unfold from whatever position they've held. Somewhere in Italy, in a town called Pescia, there's a building that used to be a convent. During the day, tourists might walk past it, never knowing the stories those walls contain. At night, it's quiet. Just an old building aging gracefully, its scandals buried so deep that even the stones have forgotten them. Benedetta is gone. Bartolomea is gone. The investigators, the skeptical nuns, the faithful ones, the priests who documented everything in careful Latin, all gone. Return to whatever comes after, freed from the constraints of time and flesh and the impossible weight of being human in impossible circumstances. And you can go too, not to death, just to sleep. Just to that small death of consciousness that visits every night, that takes you somewhere without stories, without history, without anything but the gentle dissolution of awareness into rest. Your breathing is slower now. Each breath a little deeper than the last. Each exhale releasing something, maybe tension, maybe the sadness of other people's lives, maybe just the accumulated weight of being awake when your body needs to sleep. The room around you is safe. The darkness is friendly. Nothing requires your attention. Nothing needs your vigilance. The night will continue without your participation. The world will turn, seasons will change, stories will unfold, all without you needing to witness or understand or carry them. You can let go now. Let Benedetta fade into history's shadows where she belongs. Let Bartolomea rest in whatever peace the centuries have finally granted her. Let the whole tangled story of desire and power and faith and fraud dissolve back into the archives where a historian found it, and where it can remain contained, distant, unable to disturb your dreams. Because your dreams tonight are yours alone. Not populated by 17th century nuns, or theological debates, or the particular horror of abuse dressed in holy language. Just your dreams, soft and strange and yours. The last candle in that long-ago convent has burned down to nothing. The last prayer has been whispered into silence. The last footstep on stone corridors has faded beyond all hearing. And you're drifting now, untethered from story, from history, from everything but the gentle pull of sleep. Rivers flow somewhere in darkness. Stars wheel overhead in patterns that don't require interpretation. The earth turns beneath you, patient and ancient and indifferent to all the small dramas of human wanting. You're safe. You're warm. You're here. And sleep is reaching for you with gentle hands, pulling you down into rest that asks nothing, demands nothing, judges nothing. Let yourself go. The night leans closer and your breathing matches its rhythm. Slow, steady, deep. Like waves on a shore you can't see but can feel, somewhere beneath consciousness, beneath thought, beneath everything but the simple fact of being alive and being tired and being ready, finally, to rest. Benedetta's story is over. Your story pauses here in this moment, in this breath, in this soft descent into sleep where stories don't matter and history releases its grip, and there's nothing left to do but drift. Nothing left but darkness and breath and the infinite gentleness of letting go. Sweet dreams, traveler. The past is past. The night is here. And you are safe. Sleep now. Just sleep.